Am I good?
Yeah, you're good.
You're good? Okay. Well, I just want to say in Rob's scenario, the Air Force obviously was the first one that hit the target, not the Navy. So we'll get started with that. That said, my name is Wendy Whitmore, Chris Scott. We'll slide through kind of some introductions, but a couple things that we want to start off with is just if you have questions throughout, feel free to ask them. At the time, we really like kind of an open dialogue, versus waiting till the end. So don't bother interrupting us. That's not a problem at all. As Rob said, I've known him for a really long time, back since I was in the Air Force, and Rob was in as well. So that means I've got a lot of good blackmail material. So if anyone's out tonight, then certainly let's meet up and we can share stories.
And my name's Chris Scott, and before CrowdStrike, I worked for a defense contractor. Had a lot of fun. She was my boss at CrowdStrike, and now she's at IBM. So at this point, I don't have to listen to her on the stage, right? That's at least. But we're going to zip through some things and just kind of get to it. Like she said, we like interactive. And then just for Rob, because he likes remediation, we threw in some remediation stuff as well. Because I'm the director of remediation at CrowdStrike and pretty passionate about that aspect of response.
So a couple things just to set the stage, because this is a little different than, say, the previous talk just before us. What's our agenda, I guess, or kind of the organization of the slides. We certainly are coming from an incident responders background. That's what we've been doing for quite a long time. So we're going to kind of infuse really the convergence of threat hunting, intel analysts, and incident responders, and ideally kind of show why, hey, that's a good thing. I think the fact that we're actually having this summit shows that we've made a tremendous amount of progress in the industry. We need to do more of that. And so we're going to talk about how, especially at CrowdStrike, how we'd worked with the intelligence team, fuse the data in with the incident response engagements that we conducted, and how that allowed us to then uncover some new things. So we'll breeze through. This is an adversary map. Everyone in this room, I think, is really well aware of all of the different adversaries that we're tracking. This really is just kind of a subset, right? We could probably list 100 more on that slide. So when we look at the evolution, right, how did we get here? I think many of us remember the days when we started off doing forensic analysis. You did that on one system. You moved linearly to the next system, and you kept pulling the thread, peeling the onion, whatever phrase you want to use, to then identify what was going on. Not so long ago, especially, I spent a lot of time at Mandiant. So we looked at, well, how do we kind of do wide-scale incident response? We need to do it more at the, not on the network, but at the level of the network. So let's look at all of the hosts on the network. How do we do that? But we employed kind of this approach that was still almost linear, or doing things like looking for indicators of compromise, doing that at wider scale. But the reality is if a system's already compromised, then you're going to identify after the fact, and your goal is kind of as quickly as possible after the fact that you find some sort of piece of evidence. And so at CrowdStrike, and I'll let Chris speak to that, but really what we looked to do was how do we actually move the ball forward on the field in terms of getting to the point where we can identify actions as they're occurring, categorize those as malicious or not, and then make some sort of a decision on that. And that allows us to do a number of things within the incident response process, but the primary benefit is to accelerate that process. And we'll talk about that. We've been excited to see there's a lot of people that are kind of also saying some of the same things, but I expect some of the things we say, everyone might not agree with as well. So we're looking forward to some discussion on that.
And so here, specifically, indicators of compromise, right? Been around a long time. They're a great tool, but they're the start. That's consider that like scratching the surface. It's not the primary piece. We have to be looking for those human behaviors. There's more that happens at the endpoint. There's more things that happen in the environment. And so we need to combine that IOC with what we call an IOA, an indicator of attack. And we'll talk a little bit about that. And just to give a breakdown of how that works. Like we think of the IOCs, you've got malware, you got your MD5, you get your IP address, all those different types of things. But when you think of an indicator of attack, it's more about, what the process flow, what actually happened. And one of my favorite things to do is when you think about credential theft, right? How many different ways, how many different files or executables out there can take credentials off a machine? Right? There are probably hundreds of thousands of them, and tomorrow there'll be a few more versions because someone's going to modify it. They're going to change the MD5, do that process. But when you think specifically, let's take a Windows machine. What is there, 15 ways to take a credential off a Windows machine? I mean, you can steal the ntds.dit file from a domain controller. You can inject in the LSAS, right? All these different ways. You can pull it direct out of memory. All these things that you can do. But there's only a small subset. So if you watch that subset, if you were looking across what we would consider the choke point, that is a much better place to hunt because it's really hard to change that tactic. If an attacker wanted to do something new, they've got to come up with a new technique that's very expensive. It's very easy for me to make a new file to steal credentials. It's very easy for me to change the PowerShell version of Mimikat so that you don't detect it with strings. But for me to come up with a new technique, that's very difficult. And then when you do that, if you only get to use that once or twice, you have to come up with a new technique. Again, it's harder to do. And people are like, well, will you get false positives? Yes, but I think that if somebody's stealing creds, like if a cred theft happens and it's not malicious, you as professionals probably want to know a cred theft happened because maybe it's someone that's doing a process that shouldn't be in place, right? Or if you see a command prompt launch underneath a web server process, that's probably something you should investigate because it's likely, if it's not malicious, it's bad coding that could lead to a compromise. So I don't call them false positives when you think about that process. It's just, it's a hint of something that's not working in your environment. It's something that you should go down to, right? It's the threat hunting aspect. And I consider threat hunting that time when, if you get to go home at night and go to sleep, you're threat hunting. If you talk to your incident commander, right? Google is very, if you talk to your incident commander about, I need to go take a break now because I'm too tired, you're an incident response. So we want to make sure we're staying in that threat hunting aspect. All right, so we're going to break just into a case study. I want to just give an overview of Deep Panda and how some of the TTPs changed and why this is significant to talking about hunting on your network and whether or not you have multiple adversaries. So when you think about that, right, the way that we've gone through the environment, the way that we've responded as like the response we've done, the different technologies that come out, we've forced the adversaries to change. So they're doing different TTPs, right? We need the ability to tailor the intel. We have to extract like the relevance, to get the different tools we have. All these things are changing. So what's happened with the adversaries? So before, they had these different types of tactics. And what would happen in this case study is that we would see that, they had one set of tools, they had one ways that they were operating, they were using significant pieces of malware. And then later on in the environment, we saw a change, right? They went to memory-based processing. They didn't really seem to have the same kind of persistence mechanisms. They were actually using more of a web shell type process with some different ways that they did chopper. One of the versions that everybody was familiar with, like the text version, just dropped into like the JScript eval statement. But then we also saw another version where they dropped a DLL that they time stomped on a web server, and then they had an actual entry in the ASPX page to call the DLL, which was even more hidden than the standard chopper that we typically see. But we saw this change, but our intel team was able to say, you know what, through the command sequencing for what they appear to be targeting, this is the same threat group. Why did they change? Because the initial thing was, we have two adversaries, right? Because you're seeing completely different tactics. And what that broke down to is through the process, basically what happened is as information was released about the adversary, whether it was blog posts or public like papers that were put out, the adversaries realized that their infrastructure was burned, so they adjusted their tactics. So when we start thinking about how do we hunt for multiple adversaries on our network, this is where coordinating with intelligence is very important, because sometimes even though the tactics have changed and even though those things have adjusted, it's still the same adversary. So now we'll talk a little bit more about how we look at so the TTPs are now rapidly changing, right? They're adjusting to the process and because of the information they're releasing. So the question then is, how many adversaries have been out attacking your environment? So we'll do just a few case studies on that of what we've seen.
So I think one of the legitimate questions here, and something that, at CrowdStrike we kind of constantly go back and forth with the intelligence team on is, does it matter? Does it actually matter who it is if we're just actually focused on actions and identifying malicious actions within an environment? And so there are times when, as a responder, I just want to focus on, hey, what are the tactics they're using? And let's try to mitigate some of those actions, mitigate their access to the environment. But in reality, I think when we go through this, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll look at why that actually does matter. And actually, when at times who's responsible, there are some things that's going to help you do. Making decisions based on the attack is one of those. So this is a case study where it was a client that was a think tank organization that was doing a lot of research, very influential with the government, the U.S. government. And so you might see that it says CrowdStrike Overwatch. So that's essentially the team of SOC analysts. Chris Witter, who's here, is one of the people who leads that team. So really smart people that are looking at the data constantly and identifying, basically hunting on the data. You know, what's coming up from alerts, and then what else can we deep dive and identify based on that. This organization, so the Overwatch team, identified that, hey, there's some things going on here. We should start working with the incident responders so that we can get them on the scene as well and figure out what's going on. So they identified that, and they identified some malicious activity. And what we saw as we started going through the timeline, that some of these things don't make sense. We saw that the attackers had access to the environment for a number of months. I think it might have been over a year. I apologize because it's hard for me to read that. But essentially, so we saw that go on, and then we saw a set of spear phishing emails go out. And we're like, well, hey, that doesn't really make sense, right? That's not logical. They already had access to the environment. Why are they trying to regain that? And so as we started then digging into what was going on, pretty quickly we saw that there were two distinct profiles that emerged and two different methodologies, really. So one was a Chinese-based actor who we conveniently call Pandas, and then the other was a Russian actor who we call Bears. And so we started seeing that they had pretty different attack methodologies. The Chinese were using some known tool sets. They were coded in Chinese language settings. They had a very kind of standard MO that we would expect. When we looked at the activity that was subsequent to the next set of spear phishing emails that came in, that was very different. Those attackers immediately destroyed any evidence of remote access into the environment, quickly identified what tools that the IT and security staff were using within that environment, and just gave themselves access to those tools and started using those tools to then do the same. So we saw very much kind of a stealthier methodology, a living off the land mentality from the Russian team versus the Chinese team that was a little bit more kind of blatant or flagrant about the activities that they were conducting.
Yeah, and the big thing here that really led to this process was you started looking at what the company was doing. When they were specifically looking at activities that the Russians may be interested in, that's when you see the activity from that group. When they're specifically looking at activities that the Chinese would be interested in, the PLA, then you see the activity from that group. And they were basically in the environment at the same time. And you find different time frames as you start doing the IR, some of that stuff leads back. But initially, people are like, well, why do we have this one attacker doing all these things? But as you started to look through the process and take a step back and think about, okay, what intellectual property are they going after? Well, what kind of, if you take the event logs, or if you're doing, file level logging, if you could pull that off on servers, which in some cases you can, and you see the activity of the data they're pulling, you can understand what their target is and really who it is. But then that leads you to go, okay, I've got sloppy, easy, or I've got stealth. How do I secure that environment, right? From a remediation, from a containment aspect, where do I need to focus my security spend? Because I have limited security spend, the budget is set, it doesn't increase a whole lot, and how do I focus it on the specifics that really matter? The other thing that we've seen a lot of where we're seeing multiple attackers is in point of sale systems, and this is an interesting environment. Anyone who has point of sale in their environment, it gets interesting when you think about it if you are a franchise. Because in a franchise environment, and you've got all these different people who own different properties, they have all the, whether it's vending or whatever, there's all these different franchises. The franchisee typically will set what their POS is. And so now you have one brand, but multiple attack profiles. The surface area of the attack is different because someone may select this POS vendor versus this POS vendor. Support for that may be through different remote access tools. The thing that you'll see, though, is that adversaries that are looking to break into those environments understand which POSs they understand the most, and they're going to go after that. So here in this case, you end up with multiple attackers, but not because they're after that company for a specific reason. It's just because they understand the environment. And then when you think about brand reputation, right? Think about if you're the franchise owner and you've like if you're franchising out and you have all these people that own your environment, they set the security, they set the POS malware. The POS software. They don't really spend a lot on security because they're trying to make the most money they can, but they represent you. So as we start thinking about the future of point of sale and how to move forward, I think we really need to start pushing that security down even into those types of environments.
So yeah, just a couple important things to highlight there. I think Chris is really talking about like understanding the context of the organization, and Bam mentioned it yesterday. Really understanding kind of the operational environment that you're looking at. We look at retailers, food merchandisers, hospitality, and it's still sometimes easy to kind of say, well, what does someone want in this environment, and why does that matter? But understanding how they operate, the different connectivity points, really then allows us to effectively understand, well, how would an attacker attack this environment? What are the different angles that they can take? And how can we use that knowledge to help us facilitate an accelerated response and ideally accelerated mitigation and containment to whatever threat that they're dealing with?
And if you get endpoint visibility, like when we were talking about that indicator of attack, if you think about this process, you have someone who is loading an executable that is basically scanning all of memory for credit card numbers and addresses. I'm pretty sure we can write a Yara rule to find that executable because of the way that it's looking, right? But that's the thing, like all that stuff hangs out in memory. And then the other question that always comes up when you think about this from a legal standpoint, do you have the right to touch an endpoint at those types of environments? Because of the way the agreements are written, that equipment may be owned by the franchisee instead of the franchisor. So you have to really think about the ownership and the legal aspect as you're going through that hunting process. The next big one is that whole M&A process, right? Because everyone wants to know who's buying what, and if I can buy it for this, and if I can buy it for a little bit more than you, understand your process. So when you think about mergers and acquisitions and you see the way the world is changing, and you see investments coming into the US from big countries, countries that are run from a central government that has a lot of control, if they want to buy something, chances are they're going to want to get as much information as possible, right? And so depending on where that investment is coming from, that's in the type of attack you could see. And then if another country wants to be basically looking at that, you can see the attacks coming from different places. So always be planning about what's going on in the company. This is where I always push the C-suite to say, okay, you need to talk with your hunters. You need to talk with that security team and let them understand the business role. They have a lot of information about the bad things that have happened in your environment that they don't share. If you share with them some of your future plans so that they know to be watching for these things, then they can defend that, right? So really pushing on the C-suite to share the future vision, to give you context when you're hunting so you can understand where those threats may be coming from and understand the important pieces of the business to protect. But the thing is you got to think about those multiple environments. You've got law firms or the other company that you may be acquiring, or if you are being acquired, there are all these different avenues that the targets can come to. Yeah, right. So we talk about the multiple adversary side, like why do we care, right? Who is really targeting your intellectual property, and what are they targeting? Because if you understand who is targeting it, like we talked about with the think tanks, if you understand the Chinese are coming in, you may understand the information that they're after. So that helps you protect that. Again, we talk about that security spend, right? And then you can think about, how do I contain the information? How do I really lay out my environment? How do I set my layers up? Yeah.
Okay, so on that, so Matt went and gave an exceptional presentation yesterday, right, on remediation, and really laid out, a lot of details and kind of timelines, and did things overlap along those time frames. One of the things that was really clear to me from his presentation is that a lot of times I think we use the term remediation as this kind of big overarching phrase that we may not all mean the same things. So I mentioned earlier that kind of the influx of being able to look at big data at the host base, at the event level, essentially at the kernel level, while that's going on, now gives us access to say, okay, I want to look for these types of actions, and when they occur, I'm going to make a decision. So one of the things that enabled us to do was to say, what, we can start taking some remediation actions sooner, earlier in that chain of response versus later. And there's a fair amount of criticism to that overarching idea, because you're saying, well, wait a minute, I need to collect forensic evidence. I want to make sure that if there's any kind of legal liability or notification, regulatory implications, that we're making sure we're doing all that. And then from an intelligence team, it's like, no, I want to collect as much information, right? I want all the information I can get, And then once I feel like I've learned everything I can, then I'm going to make a decision. And that's actually, Chris and I are kind of saying all of those things, because I think the ability to mitigate or contain an action, maybe you're mitigating an attacker's access to your environment, is really what we're looking at. And doing that, mitigating or containing actions or pieces of the incident, does not equal remediating the whole thing, right? Those are components of remediation. And one of the things that we are also kind of particular about is it really depends when you decide to start taking those decisions and taking some actions. It's going to depend on where the attacker is at in their chain. If they've already accomplished their objectives, if they're coming in on a daily basis, and at midnight every night they're coming in, they're packaging up data, and then they're rawing it. They're moving it to a staging server and they're rawing it, right? All of those kinds of things are things that are useful for you to know, because they're going to allow you to make decisions. And ultimately, they're going to allow you then for your leadership to be able to effectively talk to the board of directors about what are we doing today to mitigate data loss or loss of reputation or loss of intellectual property. And so I think Chris will probably kind of dive into a number of those details, but we do kind of want to set the stage on that all of these pieces of information, whether it's on the intel side feeding into IR, really helps kind of facilitate that ability to accelerate and get the attacker to be the one, ideally, that is reacting to what the organization is doing versus just kind of calling the shots and the organization reacting.
So that gets in a little bit of the speed of containment, right? We'll break that out just a little bit from remediation. As Wendy talked about the RAR files going on the server, right? When do you decide to contain that? At what point do you say my intellectual property is so valuable that I'm going to, what we've figured able to say, play the whack-a-mole game, right? But I think that when you have visibility, as you see in the how section, we'll say visibility, visibility, visibility. When we talk about network visibility and why endpoint is just coming along, we say endpoint is hard. Because when you're talking network visibility, you have an appliance that you are allowed to use 100% of the CPU and 100% of the disk, and you can just use all of the power that's there. But when you're talking endpoint, now you've got to live in this space where users are actually doing productivity. So how do we do that process, right? How do we live in that environment? The other thing when I think about visibility is everyone here hunts their network, but my question is everyone is here with their laptop open. Can anyone hunt your laptop right now? Is there anyone who knows the threats that are going on in this environment at this moment, in the middle of all these threat hunters, right? Can your team see that? So when we talk about visibility, it's getting that coverage of where your machines are at, because they're in coffee shops, they're in airports, they're at conferences, and it's becoming more of that, right? The network is shrinking. We used to have that big M&M candy on the outside. It was a big hard shell, and now that's kind of around the data center, and all of our equipment is outside of the hard shell. But do we have visibility and the ability to hunt on that? And that's what you want to be able to give those people, is the ability to hunt in places where the data and the endpoints are. And then really being able to isolate in real time, be able to control that process. When you can see what's going on in the environment, I don't really call it like whack-a-mole as much anymore, because if you know where the guy is and when he's going to pop up and you can hit it every time because you can see what's going on, then you're in a place where you can start to take that fight to the attacker. I always say, it's your network. You can make it as hostile as you want, right? You can put all the tripwires in. You can put the rakes for people to step on. This is the great graphic we had yesterday. Make those tripwires. Put those things in place. Make it a hostile environment. Really control it. Because the adversary they'll step on something, they'll trip over a thing, and you'll find them quicker. And then definitely look for those IOAs. If you can focus on finding those pieces of information that are what I would say a little bit earlier in the kill chain, then you can make a quick decision much sooner.
So, what does this all mean? So we talked about, multiple attackers and how we identified some of those. I think in one of the next slides we'll talk about, do you still have that slide in there?
Some remediation steps.
Okay. So, how as a response team, kind of how you do that. But in terms of why that's important, all of those things we're talking about kind of understanding where the attacker is in their life cycle, and then really what's their playbook? What is their plan B, their plan C? Because most of the attackers we're talking about dealing with certainly have that. They're expecting at some point they're going to get identified, but their actions will be seen and observed, and that you're going to take some actions. So having the intelligence backend of understanding who you're actually dealing with really allows you to drill down into, okay, we know that after we remove their VPN access, they're going to go and they're going to start leveraging web shells. And maybe we haven't identified those yet on the servers because they're dormant. Maybe we don't have capability to do that. But as soon as we remove this and they have identified that they no longer have that avenue of access, then they're going to do this other thing, and we need to be able to detect it. Having really that intel-driven response is going to facilitate that speed. And ultimately what we're getting at is responding at the speed of the attack, not necessarily taking this kind of response time and investigation cycle that lasts months and allows the attacker to really just have their way with the network while the team is responding.
All right, just a little bit on remediation. I believe that remediation planning starts with, or usually is like right when incident response starts. You should start to make that process, right? That early on in that game, being prepared, having someone that's in charge of that. So just some things that we think about with all the privileges. I like to think about privilege account control. And when you think about that, think out of the box a little bit. One place that we did this work, we actually developed a process in essence that put the privileged accounts for domain admins and server admins and workstation admins in an expired state until they were needed. It was a really easy way to control the account. So then even if the password was changed, the account was actually expired and it's not useful. The other thing that I always say is in today's world, there is no need for a single account that can have access to every endpoint and every server and every database. Why in the environments with the controls and the capability just built into Windows, we don't have to have an account that can access everything. Change those policies. Really set the layers in the account. We do the layers with the VLANs, we segregate the network, we have DMZs, but we don't do that with our accounts in general, right? The domain admin can access everything. Let's be adjusting that process. It doesn't need to be there. Blacklisting, whitelisting, known IOCs, when I think about the way the attackers are changing and the overhead, I say measure that depending on your environment. If you have a very controlled environment, that makes sense. If you have a lot of engineers in a creative process and they're doing a lot of coding, the weight of doing blacklisting, whitelisting, that may be too much for your environment, and you're going to spend a lot of time doing that instead of hunting, right? And so really it comes down to the way the environment flows. And then the big one for me is always the service accounts. We've run into this many times. We had one environment that had over 2,000 service accounts. And no one knows who owns all the service accounts. And not to mention, there are applications that are hard-coded with service account passwords in them and compiled. And I would say half the time, people don't know where the source code is, right? It's a business app. It's been running forever. It has an account that requires elevated privileges. It's hard-coded, and no one has the source code. These are not things to be finding during an IR. These are things that need to be found now. So these are just some of the couple of things to push on. So we talked that earlier. Where is the adversary in the kill chain, right? So you can remediate very early if you start to catch them at exploitation, installation, command and control. If you're getting to that place in your visibility capabilities, contain the machines, knock them out of the environment, make them go somewhere else. Really understand where they are in the process by having the visibility, and then you can get to them a lot quicker. And then just understand that pattern of the attack, right? That's that intel piece. Understand where they're coming from, what they're after, understand where your intellectual property is. Every company has something that makes them unique, and that's the thing that the attackers are going to be after.
We thank everyone for your time, but would love to open the floor to questions if anyone's got any.
Yeah. So you made two very good points. One was that there shouldn't be a single account which has access to everything. And you also discussed the devices in this room, a lot of them potentially being BYOD devices, which have some sort of corporate access, but also have a personal component. What are your personal philosophies as far as controlling access and monitoring access to the tools which enable forensic people and incident responders access to devices, and how do you limit personal privacy?
So for me, BYOD is one of the things, like I like BYOD phones because you can put the nice apps like AirWatch or whatever, like you can really containerize the process. When it starts to get into the laptop world, I have big concerns about the legal aspect of that. I'm a bigger fan of machines, but if you're going to still do BYOD, then I'm a fan of the VDI desktop type model, right? I want like a virtualized environment, something that I can have control over so that I'm not touching the personal world. But I always say that if your data is so important that you've got to talk to lawyers about looking at a personal machine because you're concerned about what's happening there, it shouldn't be on a personal machine at all.
You want to answer about responders?
Oh, the responder side. I do like to see the control. That's where I liked GUR, for example. You had to have that two-factor, like someone had to say, I want to do this, someone has to approve it. I do like that process on responders, being able to watch and see what they're doing and record what's going on. The only thing that I see is that people typically try to implement the tools so fast that they don't do that part because that takes time and planning. So don't get caught in the, I've got to respond so fast that I don't have time to get my tools in place and get the security that I want. Because if you don't do it at the start, you're never going to do it.
Yep.
To have the visibility when that device reattaches to an important network, and just make sure that your detections will look at data that's historical or double timestamp it so that you have when it actually occurred versus this is the event that it's new, it just came into my logging mechanism.
So,
well, yeah, so I think everyone heard the question, but what's at the beginning was kind of, isn't it more feasible to have access to the devices and visibility when they're actually on your network, or they make some sort of a connection to an internal server or device? So I think, the answer is yes, that's currently more feasible for most organizations, but I think there's a lot of technologies out there that have cloud visibility and cloud implementation where that's becoming less of an inhibitor in terms of investigations and visibility. And we look at it, your network, most of us in this room probably spend more time on planes and outside of the office than we do inside a traditional office. So the reality is the more that we can drive to having that overall visibility into devices wherever they are, the better we're going to be at detecting and containing faster. Because in the situation where maybe we have to wait a week or two till we connect back to a device, if that device, if the attacker was able to access it, if they were able to then move laterally to other systems within the environment, you can cause a lot of damage in that time frame. So there's certainly a lot of environments where cloud solutions aren't an option yet, but I think that they're decreasing overall.
When in a post-Stuxnet world where you have network-aware malware, I would much rather have my device trying to talk back to a security environment that I can look at it than not knowing what's actually going on the device. Because we've actually seen that network-aware malware, and so if you're not picking up actions as they're happening and you don't have an easy way to look even historically at that data, because who knows when you'll connect up and when you might get a detect in that process, you'll miss out. And I think it's a lot safer to be proactive about looking for the malware than to wait until that problem happens. Oh.
Statement about creating a hole. I think a part of preventing that from occurring is, making sure that for those machines that are outside of the network to do, good network segmentation so that you do get those alerts, but the machines themselves can't, penetrate further into the environment. But I do agree that in general, it can be very difficult to make sure that getting the data that you need from, BYOD or other data points can be hard, especially since those machines are the, most likely the ones that are going to infect your environment in the long term.
Any other questions?
Shall I repeat it? Do you think that a lot of environments are already prepared to detect TTPs? and are already to that maturity level. I got a feeling that there are detection tools currently provide literally an indicator-based detection, but not TTP-based detection.
Yeah, we've seen limited. So when you say TTPs, that covers like a whole bunch of different tactics, right? The techniques, procedures type process. People can do pieces of that. IOC type things are in that same process. And a lot of the systems out there can do that today. Yara, big fan of Yara. As like if you haven't implemented Yara for some of your processes, highly recommend. I'll give you one. Single byte XOR of HTTPS:// do that like on email attachments. You're likely to find implants there as they're coming in because they like to single byte XOR that in the code. So those types of things I think are very possible. A lot of people are doing that now, especially as the appliances come in that can do that. But you're not seeing a lot based on the other, like the procedures and the processes. That's where that new market of like that EDR type system that you're seeing now is coming into play because people are realizing that's where the adversary is going. So we have to get to a place where we can see that.
Does artifact handling anyway?
But it's so the artifacts. They typically you won't see those as artifacts though, because like the process tree isn't something that you can really see like from a historical sweep. Command line arguments aren't something you can see from a historical sweep, and we're seeing a lot of the attackers move to memory based. Right, so they're doing PowerShell to launch and pull their tool set to load their tool set directly into memory, and it's AES encrypted. There aren't a lot of artifacts for you to pull from that. There's no disk forensics to look at that. You have to get to a point where you can record and see what that happens in real time. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, everyone.